Hi, welcome to my project on postmodernism, in which I will talk about how postmodernism is used in Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest kid on earth, as both a tool and a detriment in terms of acknowledging, explaining, and correcting the glaring discrepancy between how consumer culture perceives history and reality. So initially, postmodernism was kind of a toughie for me. It was very nebulous. It wasn't easy to nail down in terms of understanding and conceptuality. So I went to Merriam-Webster and I found some definitions, and almost all of these talk primarily about how postmodernism exists as in a relationship with the era of art which came before it, which is referred to as modernism or often high modernism. And so when I was reading the Jameson, that really stuck out to me, is that that relationship is less linear and more circular, and that the modernism sort of feeds into the postmodernism, but that itself can eventually become the high modernism. And Jameson talks about how primary features and secondary features sort of do a flip-flop, and how first, most postmodernism emerges specific reactions against the established forms of high modernism. These formally subversive and embattled styles become the monuments one has to destroy to do anything new. And then he describes it as a periodizing concept whose function is to correlate the emergence of new formal features in culture with the emergence of a new type of social life, economic order, etc. And so that's taking it a step farther. It's correlating this art form to like linking it to developments in society and things. So I always think of it as globalization and sort of the rise to prevalence of the media and the spectacle and whatnot. And it's periodizing, so it sort of stresses the relationship, how the relationship between modernism and postmodernism is very temporally grounded. All right. It's and here's an example. The art of Pablo Picasso was originally pretty edgy, but now it's in museums and it's the art people have to deconstruct if they want to do something new. So postmodernism it's very reactionary and reappraising. It utilized like modernism's like motifs and themes and recognizable things, and it rearranges them. It destroys them often. It sort of dissolves them on occasion, and that's what's happening in this slide, which is that Jameson is saying that the modernist aesthetic is in some way organically linked to the conception of a unique self and a private identity. And then he says that postmodernism sort of has two reactionary viewpoints to that. And the first one is that in the classic age, there was individualism, but now it can't exist anymore. And then he says that the more radical viewpoint of the two is that not only is the bourgeoisie individual subject a thing of the past, it's also a myth. It never really existed in the first place. And this is sort of the bleak, desolate, utter lack of individualism, we're meaningless, you know, sort of postmodern. And I think this one is really very important to Jimmy Corrigan. And then Jameson goes on to state, because if the experience and the ideology of the unique self, which informed the stylistic practice of classical modernism, is over and done with, then it's no longer clear what the artists and writers of the present period are supposed to be doing. And that is showing how postmodernism is sort of jumping off the rails, and its destructive nature is sort of being allowed to go unchecked. So originally we had this relationship where postmodernism would take elements of high modernism and make something new, and here it's sort of with viewpoint two, it's jumping off. It's saying that high modernism is invalid, and it's saying that it was never really true, it was all a fallacy, and that it's looking at the world with a completely different, kind of more depressing viewpoint, that we as people, we're more conditioned to see things from the individualist perspective initially. Like, we all want to believe we're special, we all want to believe we have relevance and whatnot, but when postmodernism jumps in with globalization and stuff, we see that we are more small, insignificant people among this giant scheme of everything, and that's sort of how postmodernism is fueled. And then we have Jameson's quotes on the relationship between postmodernism and historical perspective. So he says that narratives don't represent our historical past so much as they represent our ideas or cultural stereotypes about that past. And then goes on to talk today about how we are not making those for our present right now, that we're unable to focus our own present. We become incapable of achieving aesthetic representations of our own current experience. It's an alarming and pathological symptom of a society that's become incapable of dealing with time and history. He says these are the very tangible repercussions of succumbing to the destructive nature of postmodernism, and saying that we can't comprehend this new art form because it's taking away all of the touch points that we use to understand culture and stories and art that were established in high modernism. And then it made me think of the movie Grease, and it's a comic book class, so we seem condemned to seek the historical past through our own pop images and stereotypes about that past, which itself remains forever out of reach. It's saying that no matter what we do, we can't be entirely accurate. And it's saying that if we don't form our own touch points now, then the future won't be able to access us. And it made me think a little more on this, but here's the thesis, the meat and potatoes. The contrast in Jimmy Corrigan between Jimmy's Superman dad and his reality is analogous to the dilemma posed by the postmodern approach to historiography, where it uses postmodern elements of Jimmy Corrigan to illustrate the failings and fallacies of high modernism in constructing society's selective understanding of the past, but eventually reneges and acknowledges the similarly sourced failings of postmodernism by incorporating a more conventional storytelling technique in the middle and at the end of the novel. In this way, I don't know if it's a novel, graphic novel, there we go, where argues that the reader and thus society as a whole will always need a common context with which to understand the present, and asserts that unchecked, the deconstructive nature of postmodernism will ultimately fail without the tenets of modernism to uphold it. And that is more in line with the Jameson, which is sort of cautioning us against delving completely into this society that is doing away with the individual, as he's saying that it's impacting our ability to have a reliable history, and I think that Ware is supporting that at the end of Jimmy Corrigan. So first, how is Jimmy Corrigan an example of postmodernist literature? Here we have a graphic. This is the sort of inside cover of the book, and if you look at it, it incorporates a lot of elements that you may be familiar with from graphic novels and things, but there aren't a lot of words. It's not very clear where to start. It's sort of disjointed. It's things with which we're familiar, but it's difficult to nail down, and it's difficult to comprehend as a reader. And the definition from the Merriam-Webster mentions ironic self-reference and absurdity, both of which are really exemplified from Jimmy Corrigan. So you see this, and then the inside pages, there is just a lot of tiny text, and it's talking about the medium. In fact, on the first page, there's a little Scantron quiz, and it tells you to disregard the rest of it if you're a woman. And I thought that it just reinforces that it's tongue-in-cheek and self-aware and designed to seem absurd, but you recognize the little pieces of it. And it arguably doesn't do, like, it gives you some backstory in some instances on like how the book is made, and in some cases how Jimmy is made, which was that one there. But it arguably doesn't advance the plot whatsoever. In addition, Jimmy Corrigan, the dialogue it's much more sparse than people like we would be accustomed to from more traditional sort of art forms. And I'd say that the choice to write these stories in the form of a graphic novel for adults is sort of a pastiche on the popularity of children's comics back in the age of high modernism with Superman and whatnot, who we'll get to in a sec. So the Superman symptom, I talked about in the thesis, Jimmy's relationship with his dad. His father's absent. He meets the Superman actor. The Superman actor calls him son. You can see on this page it's vertical. It's not horizontal like most of the rest of the book is. It's sort of sepia toned. You can follow it. It's bright. You see the bright colors. You don't see Superman without a mask. You only see him like as the character Jimmy sees him as. But then after this fantasy is in place, Ware goes into the failings of high modernism by immediately showing us how Superman is not that bastion of perfection of the manly man that high modernism would like allowed us to believe he was. He shows that he is this paunchy aging man that no one really showed up to see him perform or come talk. He makes a lackluster joke about a chicken leg, and then he takes Jimmy and his mom for dinner at a truck stop, and which is immediately followed by a one-night stand. Which is an excellent way to deconstruct the sort of morality and inherent perfection of our Superman archetype. In addition, Ware sort of points out Jimmy Corrigan's a very historical novel. You have the crossing storylines of the different Corrigan generations. History plays a big role, and so what he does is he shows how sort of the traditional ways of telling and preserving history are flawed, which is a little contrary to the Jameson, but then he sort of lunges back into the Jameson stream of thought after this. But in I chose two interactions. One's with Amy and her grandpa. She's in pink as if to exemplify that she's a grade school girl. She's doing a project. You can see her parents are both there in old haircuts. And then the green, it's very comfortable. It's a kitchen setting. And she says, "Gosh, I wish I could have seen it." She's referring to the World's Fair that her grandfather went to, and he says, well, they only let coloreds in for one day or so, I think. So it's sort of the disillusionment. You hear about how this fair brought people together from a very individual white perspective, but you don't hear about the more racist nature of America at that point, in which like our history books and stuff do an excellent job of sweeping under the rug. Such is the case also with, there was a set of 9 postcards, one of them showed a Dairy Queen, and it talks about how our proud ancestors' families and livelihoods were threatened in 1881 by a small tribe of Indians who seemed to come from nowhere with no regard at all for the society which was firmly established in God's name on the hallowed ground. So this is where making fun of that lack of a full perspective and how modernism sort of breeds that one focused viewpoint, one white viewpoint. And then the rock, where the famous treaty rock or bloodstone, what it supposedly this was showing, it's behind the Dairy Queen, you can't even see it. And so that's another bit of commentary sort of talking about how high modernism fails. So here's how he fixes it. He crushes the high modernism. He literally kills I think the singular icon most representative of that specific type of genre. And so Superman, brightly colored, as you know him, in this dim, dull backscape. No one here, the individual doesn't exist. It's all very dichromatic. No one has any distinguishing features. They're walking, going about their day. In the gutter, Superman jumps. You don't even get that sort of action shot. It's just there, splat. And then people go along their day. And this is sort of exemplifying we're saying that nothing matters and nobody cares, and that postmodernism is superior because it gives you a more general, like, accurate perspective if you take the individual out of it. So Jimmy's contacted by his dad, and even though Superman's a real person, you see the note, you see the newspaper and whatnot. I think that he's also representative of Jimmy's fantasy of his father, because he jumps after Jimmy's real dad contacts him, and he's wearing the Superman costume, and it's just a really smart way. So after this, where it's established that he doesn't give a hooey about high modernism and that he wants to sort of tell the story in this new postmodernist way, but he also presents a question through incorporation of certain elements, saying that in a society conditioned to understand art and history in the context of modernity, can we comprehend the meaninglessness postmodernity ultimately presents? Can we benefit from it? Is it tangible? Can we live with it? And I think he's saying no, unchecked, like the deconstructive modernity. Because these pages, I read about 7 different critics' reviews, which I thought only reinforced the point, but almost every single one of them said that these 2 pages was when the story clicked for them, and those 2 pages were the 2 pages that they could continue reading the story after they sort of grounded themselves on that. It was a platform from which to understand, which Ware is aware of this throughout the whole thing. He starts it with a panel that says, in which we learn that Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest kid on earth, is a lonely, emotionally impaired human castaway. And then you see a little speech bubble that says, I am a lonely, emotionally impaired human castaway. So Ware is saying that we need our hands held through all of this information, that we've been conditioned to sort of have everything explained to us. He doesn't use speech bubbles all that frequently in Jimmy Corrigan. I read an interview with him that said he preferred to have words just in the panel. But here he's reverting back to sort of an original comic sort of format with a bubble. Also, these 2 pages are they're different color tones than the rest of it. They're very bright, and you see Jimmy as a child throughout all of it, maybe representing that we as the reader need to be bathed through this information. But it sort of clarifies the events at the beginning of the novel and gives us the information, the family tree from which to go off of for the rest of the story. And this is Ware saying that he acknowledges that we need it, but he also is a little derisive of its existence. But I mean, as the critics, they read it, they needed it, and I think that sort of reinforces we can't have unchecked postmodernism as an art form and still function as a society, which is what Jameson is sort of getting to in his article. And then Ware chooses to end this sort of depressing tale after Jimmy's dad dies. He goes home, his mom's engaged, he feels alone. On the page before this, he's contemplating jumping off the building like Superman was. And then all of a sudden his coworker introduces herself and reaches out her hand. She's new. You can see she's brightly colored. She has orange hair. She's surrounded by a red desk lamp. You can see her eyes. And Jimmy Corrigan, Ware strips away the identity and significance of the individual by keeping us from seeing the faces of a variety of characters. For example, we never see the face of Jimmy's mother, but we do see the face of his coworker here on the last spread, which was an interesting choice because not only is she sort of bright and individual and restoring that sort of modernist flair, she reaches out her hand and literally and sort of figuratively pulls Jimmy out of his personal thoughts and distress, and she looks out into the snow, which is a bleak background. If you think about it, kind of representative of postmodernism. Every snowflake is different, right? But if you look at this, you can't tell. It's meaningless. It's not. It's sort of analogous, I think. But she looks out into the backdrop and she says, gosh, it's sure pretty. And she gives Jimmy that new perspective. And then we see him being carried off by Superman. He's back, he's colorful, and Jimmy's back to being a child. And then we see the script ending, which Jameson mentioned in his article as sort of being an element to harken back to the older movies by nostalgia films. So this was in my thesis where sort of lined up with Jameson saying that if you just let the deconstructive nature of postmodernism take away the significance of all of the elements of modernism with which we're familiar, we can't deal, like Jimmy couldn't deal. And he's saying that in order to comprehend this as a story and to embrace the art form, and to sort of have our own reliable history, a balance needs to be found. We can't let postmodernism completely destroy modernism. We got to return to this sort of cyclic nature of the two art forms. And so that was what I got from Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest kid on earth. That was what I learned from the Jameson and Chris Ware and everything. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully that made sense, and hopefully this is within the time limit. Third time's the charm. So thank you.